army went into the north of Sri Lanka, to the city of Jaffna, which is an ancient city, and proceeded to burn down the ancient library that contained the manuscripts, many Tamil writings, which were at least 3,000 years old. Because, of course, if you destroy, one wonderful way of destroying a community is by destroying its literature. And the smoke from that library you could see across from the other side of the island for I think, more than a week. And it's a very tragic and dramatic event. And yet, especially for those of us now looking backwards, and I'm sure if Steven Spielberg ever made the film, I can imagine the music that would go behind it. But I wanted to write and explain how normal life was, in a way, before that touch point of war starts, before those first few moments, as we were there visiting in Jaffna. So let me see if I can remember the poem. Traipsing across sports grounds, picked clean by equator sun, we visit my father's school, long-distance callers at the Museum of Memory. My father points out the places where, giggling, his friends once sat, names that belong to old men in London and Toronto now, names that could barely fit behind these desks. His teacher remains unchanged. Paper dry, voice crackling, he dictates the rights of duty and decorum, the triumph of courtesy and reason over the casual accident of race. It is Jaffna, 1983. It is one day in a long, hot summer. It is one day, seconds away from war. And decades from now, this is all that I'll remember of that visit to that country. The sand dust in the air, the sun bleaching dry the shutters, and the walls empty of pictures, not even a map of the world. Many of our pieces talk about migration, and we try to draw on legends of many different peoples who have travelled around the world. And so we like to combine both Sri Lankan legends and Irish legends, and this is an Irish legend now. Did you want to say anything about that?
There is a tale in the west of Ireland, in the most westerly part of Ireland, where we had wakes. I don't know if you're familiar with the wake. It's a funeral. There was two types of wakes. There was wakes for people who died, and there was wakes for people who went to America, because they were essentially never coming back. And at one of these American wakes, one of the local villagers in Kerry in Ireland was late, and he was a few hours late because he was out in the water fishing. And when he came in, his friend said, "Paddy, where were you?" He said, "I was out fishing, and I heard this very strange sound." And he said it was the sound of the fairies. And they said, "Well, what did it sound like?" Now, most villagers in Ireland can play the violin or something. So he said, "Well, it sounds a bit like this." And it was called Port na Buki, which in Gaelic or Irish means dance of the spirits. And we still have that tune in our Irish traditional folklore. And it's a very well-known tune for the violin. But historians afterwards have gone back on that and said, well, where was this sound from? Where did it come from? And what they think it was whales migrating off the west coast of Ireland. And that's what he was hearing when he was fishing at night. And so we wanted to write something around this piece, Port na Buki, which captures our relationship with nature and how it inspires us in many ways.
And how closely, when we live with nature, it inspires our art and our music. And with industrialization, as we move away from the nature that inspires us, we're not only killing the animals, perhaps, or the landscape, but I think we're killing something that's very precious to us as human beings in terms of our inspirations. So we wrote this. The piece is called Whale Song. There are old men still who remember that song, voices coming through the quiet like the call of the kestrel, like the keening of the wind. Life, breath, lament of the western isles, singing the song of the silver seas. Ancient days when the earth was young, when the wild woods danced and the land was free. These were no voices of mortal man, but the rhapsody instead of the elfin halls, cold and clear as unearthly bells, calling our heroes home. But long grey years have passed since then. We have rushed towards the factory and the bomb, and yoking ourselves to the wheels of progress, we shut out the sounds of the fairy song. We have cut down our woods, we have poisoned our seas, we have turned our back on our spirit's lands. In denying our past, we have drowned our dreams, leaving our shores silent, the heroes all gone. as an adult from the luxury of being in the West and trying to trace my history and think about those times that we were living through, that I realized she was what strengths she had. The times that we were living through involved, the start of the Civil War, during which 60,000 people died on each side of the war. Many, many hundreds were disappeared by the government and by the different assassination forces. And so during that period, it was amazing, I think, that as our matriarch for the family, she did not pass on any sense of that tragedy to any of the children. And we had quite a joyful childhood despite what was going on. And my grandmother used to say that the house was haunted. And I realise now that that was the least of what anyone would think, given the bloodshed and problems that were going on around at the time. So now, as an adult, I wrote this poem as a tribute to her and what she did for us. And it's called Evening. Because evening is not just the end of the day, but the drawing together of death's dark forces. Because night is a place through which shadows stalk, and a dynasty of our ghosts still wanders. Because I am the daughter of your only daughter, and the names of our sons have been vanished. You will... I'm sorry, I had to read this. Start again. Because evening is not just the end of the day, but the drawing together of death's dark forces. Because night is a place through which shadows stalk, and a dynasty of our ghosts still wanders. Because I am the daughter of your only daughter, when our sons are all dead, and the names of our living have been scattered. You will weave these dark time prayers for me, pour water biting like steel through my fingers, place ash sacred between my eyes. Grandmother, holding a house whose rooms have been emptied, where the heirlooms have vanished, and the photographs of our men are garlanded with silence. You will light these camphor lamps for me, chant mantras that pull down planets, name stars that will stay faithful, following my footsteps even into exile. About exile, as I said before, we try to work by looking at myths from other cultures as well as the Irish and Sri Lankan backgrounds that we come from. And there's a very nice Bible story from the Old Testament, of course, about that the sense of the aftermath of tragedy. And it's the story of Lot's wife. I think you're probably all familiar with that story here, right? Is anyone unfamiliar with it? But a brief summary for various reasons in the Bible is that the angel of the Lord decides to bring justice. They decide to decimate the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, and the angel is allowed to rescue any person who is supposed to be, I believe, a just man, and he finds Lot and his family and says that they have lived according to the scriptures, and so they are allowed to leave the city as the city burns down. But there is a crucial figure in this story who is often neglected, and that's the figure of Lot's wife, because the angel said, whatever you do, you can survive, the Lord will grant you your life, but you must not turn round and look at your city. And that was the one condition placed on the family. And of course, as we know the story, she turned round to look at the decimation of her homeland. And there are many interpretations of that figure. If you go and you can Google search it, in fact, these days, but there are several different theological interpretations. And one interpretation is, you see, this is an example that women are disobedient, and that's the reason that this story is told, because even at the risk of her own life, a woman will look back and disobey God. So I believe that's one interpretation that is certainly popular in America. Perhaps less popular in Sweden, I hope. And there is another, I think, Palestinian interpretation that says, well, you see, salt in the Middle East is extremely precious. It's a valuable substance. So for a woman to be turned into salt is like being turned into gold. It's what else could her family want? This is so I'm still not sure it's very flattering to women. But I thought I would look at this story, and of course other poets have, Marina Tsvetaeva and the great Russian poets have written about this story. We all have different interpretations, especially those of us who have been through war. But I think it says something very crucial. If you have experienced a moment of tragedy, and it does not have to be war. I think if perhaps any one of you has seen a car accident or some brutal event, one's life freezes at that moment, I think, and is forever changed. It's as if you can measure your life from before that event and after that event, and some part of you always remains there at the scene of the crime or the car accident. And I think perhaps that is the lesson of that Bible story, that when something like that happens and you watch your homeland burn down, part of you will always be there, wherever you go in the world. And a last thing I wanted to say about that story is, when I was researching it and looking through all these different languages and cultures for the story of Lot's wife, in not a single one did they name her name. So she is always the wife of Lot. So and I think that's very, that says something, I think, about refugee women. And when we leave our homelands, we become numbers on a piece of paper, and we are no longer names or people. So anyway, I wanted to write about that, and this piece is called Lot's Wives. We stood, as women before us have stood, looking back at our burning cities, watching the smoke rise from our empty homes. It was quiet then, and cold. We could hear the caged birds clawing at their perches, our daughters naked in the hungry mob. Such death, the smell of justice drifting on the burnt wind. And we saw it all. We saw the fire fall like rain, saw our tears track stiff white veins down our faces, saw the salt crawl through brine-cracked skin. Now, turning in the restless night, we dream we stand there still, alone on the hill's black belly, we, the forgotten, whose names were swallowed by God. A lot of our pieces are actually about not just exile, but about language and how that changes as we leave and move between different countries. And there's a story, you can tell the story of our parents.
Our parents, yes. When originally our parents were about to meet, we were married, they had never met, and so there was a neutral summit at an island off Great Britain called the Isle of Wight. And I wasn't there. But Trini was there, and there's somewhat apprehension on both sides as to what the other family would be like. On one side we had a very Catholic Irish family, and on the other side we had a very Hindu Sri Lankan family. So what could they have in common? And so they met, the parents met, And within 5 minutes we were happy, because within 5 minutes the two fathers were drawing maps of their countries and showing how the British had messed their country up in identical ways. So after that it was easy. But it did show us that there is a lot in common between our island peoples. Not just the fact that we were basically test cases for oppression, but also how culture is oppressed, how the actual format, the formula for doing so. And one of that, as Brinley has already mentioned, is to suppress the language.
So yes, and for example, if you destroy, I think Edward Said in Orientalism has talked about this in Culture and Imperialism, his books, but when you take away the language, you take away the place names of where your village is, and you force the colonial language on top of it, you destroy something very important about a community. And in 1956, in my grandparents' time, the majority Sinhalese government enacted a law overnight, which was called a Sinhala-only rule, which meant that the Tamil language, which is a Dravidian language and another ancient language that I speak, and a minority group of us speak, was outlawed in the sense that it could not be used in administrative purposes. So overnight, the Supreme Court judges who had ruled and made rulings could not speak in Tamil. The lawyers could not speak in Tamil. They could go to work if they wanted to, but they could not use their language. And the same for school teachers or policemen. So you can imagine what that does as a rule that says, oh, you're free to move, but you must not use your language, and you have to use Sinhala, the other language, the majority language. So that happened in my grandparents' case in Sri Lanka.
And happened in the same way in Ireland, where the British for many, many hundreds of years punished the speaking of Gaelic as a language and the playing of Gaelic music. But teachers, if you're found teaching Gaelic to people, and you could actually be killed. You were sent to death, or worse, sent to Australia. But I mean, I think you have something equivalent here in Mikela. Is that the name of the language? Mikela is something. I mean, it was banned here as well for many years, right? So we have something. So that's one of the many things we found in common. And well, the other thing is, once we started performing together about 3 years ago, we said, well, what fun this is, but could we have even more fun? So one of the great things, the joys about doing work together, is to find other connections musically. And there's a lot of connections between Irish music and North Indian and Southern Indian music and Sri Lankan music. So I don't know how many music students are out there, but in for example, the scales that we use in Ireland, the modalities that we use are very similar to the ones that are used in India and Sri Lanka. And they're not found very commonly in classical, Western classical music. The use of drones in Ireland, we have pipes, uilleann pipes. In Scotland we have bagpipes, and they use other drones, the harmonium and tampura in northern India, and other ones in southern India. So some of the work we do emphasizes this, especially this one we're just about to perform for you, and we call this.
Yes, so it is called. It's a blend of Irish, well, Celtic Gaelic music and South Indian music. Yes. Yeah, and so it is called Celtic Rag, and of course we wanted to celebrate our mother tongues. Colm speaks Gaelic and I speak Tamil. So we've written the piece in our languages, and we've put in English just to help. But maybe one day we'll write a Swedish verse as well. Enna in the passe pesa mudiyumana thigh molly thamala pesa ve thain molly sivan the nakahu mulakathin githanga ningale and elataku arakuru. I could choose the language in which I spoke to you, I would choose to speak in Tamil. The yearning notes, the desert drone, the heated hum of the monsoon rising. If I could choose the language in which I spoke to you, I would choose to speak in Gaelic. The sliding scale, the susurration of breath, the sound of water beating between us. We lost our words when we left our lands, when we crossed over that ocean that tastes of tears. We swallowed our songs and buried our speech, trading our tongues for a handful of beads. Vathing Shirtiana, or Goro, the Hound, the Rama, Lautlath, if Ruthel, the Hinsha. And where's a Claudian, gonna hissen and Nola, others fully on Ishta, a frivola ardra. Continuing on the theme of languages and disappearances, there is a wonderful legend which I've seen in many cultures, and perhaps there is a Swedish version. Well, if there is, please let me know. And this version is a legend about what happens when you try to suppress the truth. And let's see, there is a Chinese version of this story, but perhaps I will tell the Irish version today. And the Irish version of this legend is that there was once a sacred grove of trees, and the High King of Ireland had said, well, we must keep these trees preserved, and no one should touch it. And there was a magical tree growing right in the middle of the grove. But one fell dark night, the tree was chopped down and disappeared. And of course the king issued a proclamation saying, we should find who this criminal was, and there's a death penalty involved. But no one knew who had done this terrible deed, and the magical tree had gone. And a few years passed by, and in the meantime, many things changed in the kingdom. But there was a story of a minstrel, a wandering musician who was wandering through the courts of Europe, and perhaps even he came to Skåne and played his music here through all the northern Europe, and he came back to Ireland, and the king had heard of him and said, you must come to the royal court and play your harp, because this musician was so famous. And the musician came to the court and decided to perform for the king in the way that we're performing for you now. But as soon as he had pulled out the instrument and started to play it, the harp started to sing with its own voice. And the harp said, lo and listen to my song, because I am the harp that was made from the wood, that was made from the wood, from the tree that was cut down in the sacred grove. This is the man who betrayed you. And it's a story you see about, however much you hide and however much people might try to profit from the suppression of truth, eventually the truth comes out. And there's a Chinese version of the story as well. But I wanted to write something about that. And during the years of censorship that went on in Sri Lanka, of course, we became very familiar with that truth. There are many people who are both Sinhalese and Tamil, brave people who tried to publish as journalists and tried to explain what was going on in the war, and who were threatened by both sides of the military and the terrorists. And so many people lost their lives in trying to tell the truth. And I wanted to write something about that, and perhaps an example of how that attitude still carries on even today, well, even until 2 years ago, was when the tsunami hit Sri Lanka. It mainly devastated the east and part of the southern coast. But the capital city, sorry, the other way around to here, the capital city, Colombo, people there did not hear about the tsunami, and they were not told how many thousands of people had died in the other parts of the country, because they were mainly Hindus or Catholics or Muslims. And it was not announced. And our Sinhalese friends who were living in Colombo told us that the first time they heard it was to tune into the BBC World Service and hear that 30,000 people had died on the other side of the island, because the government radio had nothing about the tsunami. So that's an example of how information does not come through even on a small island. But this piece is perhaps more general, and perhaps about other countries as well. My country is a white blindness, an absence of newsprint, a vacuum of words, the falling snow of radio static. So where is there left for me to pour out my secrets? I will dig graves deep in the earth for them. I will tear holes in the white silence of the page and bury the words of witness deep in the tomb of the text. Let them bear fruit there. Let the sprouting grasses shout out their secrets. Let the blade-cut reeds blare out their names. Continuing to think about that theme of language and exile, one of the strange things that happens, I think, particularly I think it's true for Sri Lankans, is when we are in foreign countries. For example, I've been in Germany, in different places, France, and I think I see another Sri Lankan. It's very exciting because I think we look quite unusual, and there's a desire to rush across the street and welcome your compatriot. But after that initial incentive, as you start to cross the street, you start to think, what should I say to them? And you think, well, I can't ask your name, because if I ask your name, or I tell you my name, perhaps we are different races, and it might bring up some bad memories of the war. So I won't ask your name. Okay, so what else can I say? Perhaps I can say, where are you from? No. Okay, which part of the island? Okay, you can't say that. You can't ask about that. So then perhaps you can say, well, are you Sri Lankan? When did you leave Sri Lanka? But I think even that says something about your history. It's like a code, because for those of us who left before 1983, it means we probably had more money, and we came to the West for professional reasons. But if you left after 1983, it's because you had no choice, and you were probably a refugee, and it probably means something about how you're living now. So really, you begin to realize as you cross the street that you have very little that you can say which is not potentially explosive, and apart from talking about the weather. And I thought this was a very strange Sri Lankan dance that we do. You know, you cross the street, you stop, you want to talk, but you can't. But when I was giving this reading in London last year, a gentleman came up to me from Kosovo, and he said, yes, this is the Kosovo dance. We also do it, because we think we see a fellow person from our country and we want to speak, but then we pull back, and it's as if you're a pendulum. You don't know whether to go forward or back. And I think this is an experience for many refugees or people who have been through a bad history. And something about what little we can say, even in the West. So this piece is called Language Like Birds. It is Paris, Berlin, New York. It is any one of countless cities, any one of countless lands in which we find ourselves, our careless hurrying through crowds cut short, silenced in one moment by the sight of teeth and hands and jaw, by the familiarity of bone. These are the faces that reflect our own, the eyes of exiles that will search and search again for patterns in the skin, kinship in the bones, history in the handshake of strangers. But we have no words to express our loss, no tools to measure out the length of our leaving, fleeing before the war's black howl. We left behind language, words too heavy a burden to carry. Destiny, family, fate. These are the words that remain when we find each other in foreign lands, when we break open each word of our language to share, to savor, to set free. We open our lips, and language, like birds, bursts from our throats, words exploding across city streets, staccato stammer, brief as the violence of gunfire.
You have to give her a break at some point. So, in keeping with our experimentation with combining various forms, we decided to bring together a number of great musical artists. We're based in San Francisco, and we brought a number of other people from different genres together and asked them to do the same as what we do. So we had, for example, a gypsy from Tamil Nadu in India, and we got him to perform with a Filipino poet. We got an Irish solo singer to sing with a Native American singer, and they worked together and composed new work together. And the album that came out was called Bridge Across the Blue, because many of the songs that were brought into the project were essentially the blues of their various countries. I mean, we all know about the blues of the Africans and how it's transformed American music and turned into jazz. But I think a lot of immigrant people have blues when they come in. Just comes in different forms. And in some way, Irish music, I think a lot of people know about the happy music. River dance has spread around the world, and you all think we're pathologically optimistic in Ireland as a result. But with all that rain, there's also a dark side. There's alcohol, and then there's very slow music, where it comes out. We have a thing called a slow air. And this next piece I'm going to play for you, which is on the album, is called The Bluest Line. And it's a kind of a theoretical one. What would have happened when you combine Irish music with African blues? And there is some precedent for it, because in the 1900s and earlier, when the African slaves were brought to America to do their work, there was also indentured servants from Ireland and a few other countries as well, working side by side. Slightly different conditions, but not very different in some contexts. And at night time they would get together and they would share their stories, share their songs. And when emancipation came in America and slavery was abolished, many of those Irish and some of those African Americans came up north to New York and Boston and created new forms like tap dance. Now, tap dance is a combination essentially of African, Caribbean, and Irish dancing. It's they're not like this, but there's other things, there's other forms. Broadway musicals, they owe a lot to that combination of African and Irish music. So this is what would happen, I think, if you combined Irish slow airs and blues.
speaking of the album, another piece that is on our album, Bridge Across the Blue, is a piece about the commonalities now between Sri Lanka and the deep south of America. When we left Sri Lanka, my parents moved to London, and during the 1980s there was a lot of racist hate crimes and a lot of violence against South Asians. And I grew up feeling quite bitter about that sense of at least racism in England. And when I came to America, I thought it was the land of liberty and freedom, and that they didn't know anything about racism. And of course, I was quite young then. But luckily, when I arrived in America, one of my first teachers was my Aikido teacher. I study many things, but one of the things I study is martial arts. And my teacher, Dick, he's called Dick Stroud, and he is a very elderly African-American gentleman, and he took me aside and he said, listen, there's one or two other of us who also know about racism, and told me a little bit about his history and his experience growing up in America in the Deep South. And so I learned from him. But it was only, in fact, years later that he used to tell me stories about him and his friend Sydney and what they used to do and how difficult life was in the early 50s when he was trying to be a black actor in Hollywood. But it's only in later years that I found out that his friend Sydney is, his full name is Sidney Poitier. And so there's a few other people that know about him. And of course, Sidney Poitier had many struggles of his own that he triumphed over. So I feel very blessed and lucky to have learnt from a teacher who also learnt from Sidney Poitier. So this piece is really about Dick Stroud's experience, and partly it mentions the common stories. In Sri Lanka during the ethnic cleansings, during the ethnic strife. One of the things that used to happen was that when a village was attacked, that in the morning you would see the bodies of women hanging from the trees, the women who had been killed. And it's an image that, of course, is very significant in the deep south of America, where such lynchings also happened. So the piece is kind of dedicated to Dick Stroud, and there is one word that is Japanese in this. It's dojo, and it means it's a martial arts sacred space and training place. This piece, we usually perform it with a jazz orchestra, so you'll have to, I'm afraid we did not bring them to Sweden with us, so you'll have to imagine a trumpeter and a jazz orchestra behind me.
Or buy the CD.
Or you can buy the album.
Whichever you want.
Okay. And so the piece is called Margin of Colour. Cradled within my skirt, a child asks why my hands are not painted on the inside, turning them over, palm to knuckle, flesh to rind, tracing the margin of colour, scalloped between my fingers. Years later, I will meet you, Dick, in a bar on the wrong side of Boston, in a bar where colour was our password, where we checked our daytime faces at the door, letting our words unwind instead. Notes of the blue, black, gold, sounds of the night inside us, rising in one anthem, universal to our memory. Striding through burning streets of summer, brushing aside taunts of nigger and coon hurled at you from speeding cars, spoke to me of foreign worlds, of Alabama in the 50s, of their involvement in the darkness, and told me what Sydney told you before Martin ever started marching. Years later, watching you framed by the stark lines of the dojo, seeing you teach the twist and turn of the joint, one black face in an ocean of white linen. I I will watch your hands, steady as the scalpel, clear as a carving, and notice for the first time your palms, like my father's, dusk within darkness, the colour of bruised fruit. I have a new poem, and I would like to share it with you. And I was thinking a lot about the sea and the oceans, and about being in Europe. And this piece is written about, well, it's written about a place near London. It's the nearest pier. How would you say it in Swedish? It's the jetty that comes out into the water. And Southend Pier is the nearest place. It's a very long pier that juts out into the water. And when Hindus die, many Hindus choose to be cremated. And there's, if you're lucky, you can take your ashes back to the Ganges to be scattered in the river. But if not, there is a belief that it's important to be in the open sea, to have your remains join with the ocean. And so in London, that's impossible. The Thames is a dirty, polluted river that no one, living or dead, would want to be part of. So what you find is this curious phenomenon now as the Sri Lankan population in London is aging. I notice that as my relatives are getting older and dying and getting cremated, there is a need to find a river or a sea to which to put the ashes. And so people make this strange pilgrimage to Southend. And if you know Southend, if you've ever been to England, don't go to Southend. It's a very broken down little town with kind of carnivals and fun fairs and cheap caravans. And what you will see in the middle of this is a very strange procession of Hindu Sri Lankans in full ceremonial garb, trying to do their funeral rites in the middle of gypsy caravans and people doing circuses. So there's a strange conflict going on there. So I wanted to write about that. It is bad luck, you say, to bring home the ashes. I had imagined coffins, jet planes, grease smoke by the Ganges. But you say that would be just another country, one more pile of dense, translated forms. Instead, we have raincoats over saris, seagulls dive-bombing garlands, a snowstorm picking up from the southeast. It becomes an awkward pilgrimage, this faltering down a booming pier, self-conscious and adrift, like those lives lived in dim shadows, fearing the sudden raid at midnight and deportation's dawn. Standing in the railing's lee, we throw rice, grains, the last words of Sanskrit, into the endless water, into an English sea. So our last piece is also about the idea of memory and movement and migration in a way, but now it's set in America, and the piece is called The Night Train to New Orleans. And a long time ago, I had decided to leave a young man in New York, and we broke up the relationship, and I decided to jump on the next train leaving New York. Well, the next train leaving New York was actually going to New Orleans, so I ended up going hundreds of miles down south. And but I find that I would actually recommend it to anybody who's breaking up in a relationship. It's a nice long train journey to think about what you've done. And the great thing is you leave New York and it's cold and dirty and polluted, and you go further and further south, and the landscape opens up, and you're in a beautiful land where you can see the trees, you can see the the Spanish moss, it's like old man's beards hanging from the trees, and life becomes very slow down south, and it's like honey, and it becomes warmer and cleaner. So, you know, I think it kind of reflects something about good things come about sometimes when you jump on a train and leave somebody behind. And in my case, something very good happened because I met a young violinist and I married him. So he likes this story as well.
Okay. But before we do this, I'd just like to thank Lars again and Sassanet for having us here.
Yes,
thank you very much.
Thank you. It's a wonderful way to be introduced to Sweden, and in fact Scandinavia. This is the first time we've been to Scandinavia, and it's our first day here. So thank you to the Swedish South Asian Studies Network.
And to Bubu as well.
And to Bubu for hosting. Thank you.
Okay. It's not supposed to make any difference for blues anyway when you tune. So.
Twilight haze hangs a shroud sacred over evening trees, and I am rushing on, breaking trust, leaving the first train south, and I am moving on, heading down the long road home. Southern light slants its lines, languid in the insect heats, and I am burning up, melting down, prisoner of the amber dust. Silhouette of Spanish moss turning evening light. The soot-black crow lifts her wings, harbinger of coming dissolving into darkness, spun between station lights. I am merging into rhythm of train turning into night. I very much hope the American security will let us travel with this in our hands. Thank you.
So we'll be selling CDs here if you want. I think it's 150 kroner. I think that's
Is that the...
Yeah, that should be
Please come
equivalent.
up if you have any questions or would like to talk to us about anything we've written about today. We'd very much like to meet you. So.
Or if you have any questions now, we can. I don't know if you have any open questions that you want to talk about.
I think people,
Okay.
people usually like to talk.
Okay.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much, guys. Thank you.